The first step when adding a blur onto the outside of this image is to merge all of your layers together. So I'm going to click on my first layer at the top, since again with the collage you're going to have multiple layers here already put together. And then I'm going to scroll all the way down to my bottom layer, and I'm going to hold down Shift, and that will highlight my first layer to my bottom layer. So again, you're clicking on your first layer, hold down Shift, scroll down to your last layer, click on it, and then you're going to right click, so click with 2 fingers if you have the MacBook, and go down to merge layers. So then all of my layers are into one layer right here. Make sure before you do this you have your collage saved somewhere separately as a Photoshop file. That way you can still go back to it and have all of your layers. But from here I am going to duplicate my image, so duplicate my layer that was merged. So again, right click and go to duplicate layer, and then I'll hit OK. So I have 2 copies of that image, and on my top copy I'm going to add a Gaussian blur. So the fastest way to find this is if you go to help and just type in blur at the top. You will see a bunch of different options come up. Choose the second one that is again the Gaussian blur. I'm going to click on that, and yours should come up with a preview button to adjust how much blur you want. So when that does show up, you can kind of slide that dial around to add the amount of blur that you want on your image. So you can play around with that. But once you have the blur selected and added to your top layer, what you're going to do is add a mask. So the layer mask is on the bottom of the layers panel there, the little square with the circle. So I'm adding a mask. And then my paintbrush is set to black. So I have the paintbrush selected, it's set to black. If you click this folder here, you can choose a brush to use. I would choose one that has a feathered edge, so something like this first brush. And then I'm going to make the size of that brush a lot bigger, which the shortcut to adjust the size is right underneath the delete button. So there's those 2 brackets for larger and smaller brush, or just use the drop down arrow there. And then it's set to normal at the top. Opacity is 100%, but you can move that around as you go. And then I'm just going to start to paint over the area that I want to be clear. So the inside is most likely where you'll want it to be clear. You could play around with maybe some areas being blurry, some separate areas being clear if you want them in different areas. But for the most part, I would start in the center and kind of work your way out. I'm going to make my brush a little bit bigger here towards the outside. And if you lower that opacity, you can almost fade the blur a little bit more, so you have that blur faded nice from the details in the middle to more of the blur on just the outside of the image. So play around with that opacity with the blur effect on your photo. So you can hide your blur to see before and after, but that could help to just kind of tie in that background to the foreground of your collage.